Hi, Lori. How are you today?
Good, how are you?
Good. Welcome to review. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start review. If other people join us as time goes on, that's fine. I suggest that you have your review sheet open so that if you have some questions, I can help answer them for you, okay?
Okay.
All right, so this is review for exam 2 for art history 1. The exam. Oops, I'm sorry, I need to edit this one slide. So the exam isn't going to be sent to you. The exam's already posted on Blackboard. It's posted today. I am still grading exam 1, but they will be all done by the end of the day. So you should have a good idea of what you needed to adjust for the next exam. So please take a look at my feedback on the first exam. If you're not taking a look at the feedback on all of your homework quizzes, you're not getting what you need to out of the homework. So be sure that you go back and look at all of your homeworks and make sure that you understand why the right answer was the right answer. And if you have questions, please don't hesitate to pick up the phone and give me a call. Yeah, this slide right here, I'm going to change altogether. So kind of just ignore that information until I get that done. Exam 2 is in the exact same format that your last exam was in. So it's got 2 parts. And you know what? Give me just 1 second. All right, well, I apologize. This is not the right PowerPoint that I wanted to share with you. So let me try that again. That's art history 2. There we go. All right, sorry about that. Let's try this again. Okay, this is why the other slide was kind of wonky. So let's just start all over. Please forgive me. This is review for exam 2. These are the eras that we've gone over, and we're going to go over each one of them individually. All right, so exam 2 is going to be the exact same format that exam 1 was in. It says there's a major change. There isn't. It's the exact same format. So if you remember correctly, exam 1 is split into 2 sections. Be sure that you do both parts, part A and part B. I don't think I had anybody last test that only did one or the other, but just make sure that you don't accidentally not do one of the parts. So part A is multiple choice and part B is short answer. All right, so what to do if you miss the exam? So unless you've arranged an extension at least 48 hours in advance, then I will not accept your exam. So if you end up in the emergency room on Friday night and you were planning on doing the exam on Saturday, please take the time to get back with me so that I can give you an extension. As well as if you happen to have documentation that says, hey, I was in the emergency room for a good part of the week, I'll give you an extension based on an agreed upon date. But I ask you to head these things up because if you don't, you're going to get a makeup exam instead of the exam that everybody else took. In addition to, I think that it's easier for me to extend the due date than hold up all the other students taking the exam and getting their feedback. So please be proactive in that. Okay, so just a reminder on the exam, you are only allowed to use your textbook and your notes, absolutely no Google. So we can break down each work of art by looking at the stylistic features of that work of art. Then we compare the stylistic features of the work of art to work of art of that era. So let's take a look at the eras that we've looked at so that we can see what I mean by breaking down the stylistic features. So going back to unpack just before we start in, these are the eras of art history that we've been looking at in the past few weeks. So Etruscan, Roman Republic, early Roman Empire, High Roman Empire, and late Roman Empire. Lots of Roman Empire in there, right? Late Antiquity, first golden age of Byzantine, the second golden age of Byzantine, and Islamic art. Don't forget that we often call the first golden age of Byzantine the age of Justinian. I use it interchangeably, but for the sake of continuity on the list and in the exam, I've listed them as first golden age of Byzantine. So just in case you got any confusion there. All right, so let's talk about Etruscan art. Etruscan art was often made of terracotta. They were the only civilization that we've studied that liked terracotta as a major medium. Ancient Greece used terracotta in their clay pots, but that was it. The Etruscans used terracotta in sculpture. They used it in their building architecture as well. Terracotta has an interesting hollow element to it. The Etruscans loved pattern. We see that show up in their fresco paintings a lot. Their clothing was highly stylized. We looked at it in terms of wet drapery technique. It is wet drapery technique, but it does look different than the wet drapery technique that we studied in ancient Greece. They tended to cremate their dead in cinerary urns. So the image that you see here on the right with the woman reclining is a cremation urn. The remains of the couple are inside the urn. They believed in an afterlife, and their religion was something that unified them, as well as they all spoke the same language. They tended to place sculpture on top of the temples. So if you remember right, they were hollow, they were clay hollow inside and fired in an or in a kiln, just like we fire pottery in today society. They had a hole at the base of the sculpture so that they could attach the sculpture to the roof line. So you see here where they've attached these sculptures to the roof line. That was because they often had earthquakes, and they knew if they attached the sculpture to the roof line, they had less chance of the sculpture falling over if it was on the ground or if it was simply sitting on the building. Terracotta is fairly lightweight if you compare it to marble, and so that concern of things falling makes sense. In the 6th century, Etruscan tombs were heavily decorated in fresco. At the beginning of the Etruscan Empire, early Etruscan temples were not as heavily decorated in fresco painting, but at the height and end of the Etruscan Empire, the fresco was a common medium that was a favorite. It helped them to tell stories into the afterlife or record festivals and important things that happened in Etruscan society. Anybody have any questions about the Etruscans specifically that they'd like to answer or talk about? Okay. All right, so let's move on to art of the Roman Republic. Remember, this is art pre-empire. So the Roman Republic is not as strong as the Roman Empire. They haven't conquered as much land. However, they have very distinct art. They have art for two purposes. Purpose one is to, Purpose one is to record lineage. So art that shows ancestral heritage. Remember, there are no photographs. So in order to prove that you're a patrician, you have to prove that your dad and brother before you were a patrician, or your dad and your grandfather were a patrician. And so because of that, we often have lineage sculptures. The other thing that they valued very much was verism. Verism is a technique in which they show wisdom through old age. So I guess what I should say is they valued wisdom and they showed that through verism. Oftentimes you will see a statue with a body that is a perfectly reasonable looking male body, idealized average age of about 30, with a head that looks like the person's about 70 or 80. That is because they associated age with wisdom. And so you get these really kind of wonky looking sculptures where the heads don't seem to match the bodies. The other type of art they had was funerary. You can see here on the right, a funerary piece done for the vegetable vendor. He has a large head and large hands. And this particular work of art has twisted perspective because the tabletop is turned parallel to the picture plane so that you can see the wares that the vegetable vendor is selling. He sold bread, he would have sold vegetables. And then underneath his table is a basket that he would have kept all his supplies in and carried that every day to the market. Well, I told you I was having PowerPoint issues, and once again, this was not the exact right one because the additional slides are not in there. So give me a minute. I'm going to close out this particular slide set and we'll open the next, okay? Aha, that was exactly what I was looking for. Okay. So here we go. Let's see, am I sharing the right thing? Yeah, looks like it. Okay, sorry about that. I re-record these for every single class. So sometimes I get lost with how many of them that I have. So I need to go back and do some housekeeping, I see. I apologize. Okay, so we started with Roman Republic. We talked about the patrician and plebeian sculptures. The patrician are the hereditary sculptures. and the plebeian are the funerary sculptures. The last two examples I gave you, one was the vegetable vendor and one was just the head. But here you can see the verism that's present in the idealized body that I just talked about and head, as well as here you can see a group of funerary sculpture that's plebeian. You can see that the men on the right and the left were not the men on the right and left may not have been plebeian, they may have been patrician, but the man in the middle was likely the plebeian. So if you remember, the plebeian funerary art often depicted the patrician slave owner and the plebeian slave who was freed. So keep that in mind. If you're looking at a relief that is Roman, that is a funerary relief and not a full standing sculpture. And it's usually of just people that look like ordinary people. It is a plebeian funerary sculpture from the Roman Republic. Okay, and there again, that's the slide that I just showed you before we switch PowerPoint. So here's the vegetable vendor and the veristic head that we talked about. All right, let's move on to the Roman Republic or Roman Empire, moving on from the Roman Republic. You can see that patrician art tends to lose its verism. So here is the head of Caracalla, and on the right, you can see the image of Augustus of Prima Porta. Both images you can see are highly idealized, and that veristic head goes out the window. You get an idealized youthful portrait. We don't know if this is what the rulers both looked like in real life, but we know that this was an ideal standard of beauty, and there are enough individualizing features that we know that the individualizing features make this a portrait. The empire is expanded the furthest under Emperor Trajan. If you remember, Trajan was the very first emperor who wasn't Italian, he was Spanish. So his line starts including people who were not Italian. Triumphal arches are common, and they lead, the road underneath them is called the Sacred Way. You can see they're constructed in a post and lintel construction with a barrel vault. At the very top here in the attic, you see that there's an inscription that talks about important things that the emperor did within his lifetime to contribute to the empire. Triumphal arches were often dedicated to one emperor, or they were dedicated to a certain event, like a war or something like that. But typically they honored an emperor. You can see that they have Corinthian columns, that engaged Corinthian columns, and that the barrel vault here gives opportunity for sculpture inside. Most of the time, the triumphal arches were an opportunity for social control. Plebeians at this time gain acceptance through non-Roman, through non-Roman heritage, just like Trajan. Mark Antony and Cleopatra rule the African areas of the empire and try to take over, but they're eventually defeated. All right, I was just checking to make sure nobody else was joining us. Any questions so far, Lori? I know my sort of run around with the Roman Empire and the Roman Republic might have been a little confusing. So any questions at all? Okay.
Oh wait, yes, I did have a question.
Okay.
Um, what was kind of just the big difference between the plebeians and patricians in their art?
Okay. Let me go back over that so that we're clear, because I kind of confused you a little bit. So plebeians have one type of art only, and it's funerary. So they're like commemorative grave sculptures. They're relief sculptures. So this is a common example of a plebeian work of art in the Roman Republic. Another one is this one, the vegetable vendor. So sometimes, like in this example, the plebeian art commemorates the patricians that bought the slave. So in this case, these two people are the patricians, and the guy in the middle is the slave that they purchased. In ancient Rome, if you were purchased as a slave from a different land, because Rome was constantly conquering other lands, they would bring the slaves back to Rome. The patricians would purchase them, and the plebeian slave had the opportunity to work off their freedom, basically. So they would agree upon a certain price, and then the plebeian slave would work to gain or earn his freedom. Then the patrician would sign a legal document that said that the plebeian was free to go. And often when the plebeian slave died, they would honor the patrician who purchased them and then freed them. So this is an example of that type of commemorative grave marker. This one of the vegetable vendor is one in which the plebeian person was not probably a slave, but born into the plebeian class. And his funerary marker honored the things that he did as a businessman in society. Does that clear that up a little bit?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. So just to be 100% clear, plebeian art was funerary only, and it was to commemorate the passing of the person. Patrician art was more about what the person did while they were alive. So patrician art had to do with, number one, recording the lineage of how they got to be patrician, or recording what it is that they did in society that was considered a patrician job. So this guy here on the right, he was a patrician. You can see that because his head has verism and his body is idealized. That meant that he was some sort of official. So we think that he was probably a general. So a lot of times patricians held status like being a general, or, oh, and I don't have, or they, I apologize. I usually have a slide that shows you an example of the lineage, the recording the lineage, or you'll get a statue like this that has a couple of other heads in it. So it'll be one full statue and the man will be holding two heads. Those two heads are how that man got his patrician lineage. It's how he inherited his social class. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for asking that question. Okay. So any more questions about the Roman Empire or the Roman Republic? Okay. All right, so now we're going to move on to late antiquity. If you remember, late antiquity was basically early Christian art. Remember that the early Christians don't have a artistic tradition yet. And so they're sort of making it up as they go along. They're looking for their artistic voice. they often use syncretism to show biblical stories or biblical tales. So the large image you see here shows the story of Jonah and the whale, this one here. This is Jonah being eaten by the whale. Now, most people look at that and say that doesn't look a whole heck of a lot like a whale to me. But in ancient Rome, not very many people had actually seen a whale. In addition to, they had seen mythological creatures. And so most of their biblical stories are related back to that imagery that they already know, which are those mythological creatures. So they kind of make it up as they go along. So you get syncretism. Syncretism is the combining of one culture into another. So the Christian culture or the Christian people took the old pagan culture and used the pagan images to create a new Christian voice. Christianity is illegal until Constantine declares it legal and as the official religion of Rome. But remember, images of Jesus on the cross were very rare and were illegal. We studied one, and we studied one because it was so rare. In the beginning, images of Jesus images of Jesus contain plebeian traits. So large head, large hands, shorter bodies. They don't sort of stick out as being images of Jesus at all. As time goes on, Jesus changes form to looking more like a patrician. Okay, I told you all of that. Any questions about late antiquity or art of early Christian anything? Okay. So this is the first golden age of Byzantine. This is Hagia Sophia, and this is the mosaic of Justinian at San Vitale. Remember that the first golden age of Byzantine is also called the age of Justinian. But for the most part, I've used it in your exam as being the first golden age, just for clarity purposes. Stylistic features, we see tons of mosaics with gold heavy patterning and lots of precious gems. That gold heavy patterning is usually used in the background. And then they also really love, textured borders that have precious gems in them. So the one on the right, you're looking at emeralds and pearls. We have special terms that we associate with these type of mosaics. They're called isophalic because they're so flat. They kind of look like a cookie cutter stamped out the people in the mosaics. The exteriors of churches were often very plain because they didn't want the focus to be on the exterior of the church. They wanted the focus to be on the interior of the church. So the idea was that when you were out in the world, the church didn't look like anything special, but when you open the door, they wanted you to feel as if you were being transformed, or that your experience was transformed into a meeting of the divine with heaven. So that makes the interiors of the churches very elaborate, very light, very heavy in gold leafing, and bringing in as much sunlight as possible. We see lots of pendentives and squinches. Christ on the cross is still illegal. And we often see Christ with a mandorla behind him, which is that egg shape we talked about. Images of Christ are now showing him as patrician. If you remember, the name to the little gold or the small glass tiles that make up the mosaics is called tesserae. Artistic examples that we looked at, obviously Hagia Sophia on the left, and on the right, portraits of Justinian and Theodora, which were the mosaics at Ravenna. We also looked at the Rabula Gospels. Basic background information about the first golden age of Byzantine. Justinian's trying to control much social unrest. Remember, the empire is still very large, and it is difficult for one emperor to keep control over all of the empire due to how large it is. They have communication challenges, and the local government has a lot more control than I would say the local government has a lot more influence over the everyday lives of the people. Justinian moves the capital to Ravenna for social control purposes, but he never actually goes to Ravenna. The mosaics of him and Theodora are supposed to represent him being in Ravenna. The Ottoman Empire is really challenging Justinian, and Justinian's desperately trying to keep a hold of the land in North Africa and in southern Spain. Those lands are being challenged by Islam. Any questions about the first golden age? Okay. So the second golden age of Byzantine is a golden age that switches the look of Jesus. So we talked about Jesus moving into a more patrician representation from the early Christian plebeian style. Now we see Jesus as being represented as the King of Heaven, but we get a new look to Jesus's face, and we label it the Pantocrator. If you look at the left side of the face, his face is less wide. His eye has a little bit more bagginess, and his mouth is turned down on one side. If you look at the right side of his face, it's a little bit more gentle. This is apparent in the PowerPoint that I showed you, in which you could see both halves of the face put together. So really you get two images of Jesus squished into one face. One's the sort of kind image of Jesus. The other one is sort of this concerned and judging image of Jesus. The hand being raised here is a sign of benediction, which just is a blessing sign. We see lots of Greek crosses. Remember, there are two types of crosses that we studied, the Latin cross and the Greek cross. The Greek cross means that the arms of the cross are both similar in size. They're equal in length. So you can put them in a square or a circle. So the Greek cross often has a circle around it. We see that Jesus usually wears bright colored clothing. Remember that blue and purple are very expensive to create. Blue comes from lapis lazuli crushed up, and purple comes from an ink that snails make in Asia. So those bright colors are indicative of imperial status. We see a sense of imperial patterning. We talked about that from the time of the age of Justinian into the second golden age of Byzantine. That involves these heavily lined treatment to the eyes, these blush colored rosy cheeks, and these rosy lips. If you look at the PowerPoint from the first golden age and the second golden age of Byzantine, I explain in depth what that imperial pattern looks like. So if you need to, go back and refresh your memory on that. We see modeling of the figure in the mosaics. So the idea that the body turns in the light. You can see it well here on Jesus's neck. Images of Christ on the cross are more common now. In the late half of the Second Golden Age of Byzantine, we see lots of iconoclasm. Iconoclasm is the destruction of an image for religious or political purposes. So if you're talking about iconoclasm from an ancient culture, oftentimes in sculpture, you'll see the eyes gouged out or the noses knocked off of a sculpture. When it comes to an actual icon, they were just seized and usually burned. Artistic examples that we looked at in the Second Golden Age of Byzantine in terms of architecture was the Catholicon. We see in architecture that churches become more decorative in the exterior. So they use more varied colors of brick and stone. Definitely not as decorative as some of the fancy churches we get in the Romanesque and Gothic, but definitely more variation in colors of stone, more decorative stones, and they're even starting to include grates for the windows. We also looked at the Church of Dormition. Background information, Byzantine lands are being threatened heavily again by the Ottomans, same problem that Justinian is having, and eventually they lose the north part of Africa and the lower part of Spain. The final era that we covered that the test will cover was Islamic art. Stylistic hallmarks of Islamic art, they rely heavily on geometric patterning. That geometric patterning, is supposed to help the person who's praying focus on the other world and their prayers so that their prayers go up and are heard in the heavens, and to kind of focus the worshiper away from worldly things. We often see in Islamic art decorative texts from the Quran. That alternating light and dark pattern, like you see in the image in the lower right here, is something that we attribute to influence from Islam. The pointed arch, which I don't have an example here for you of a pointed arch, but it's just this arch with a point that comes from Islam. Examples of things that we studied that were Islamic art were the Dome of the Rock, the Kaaba, which is this image right here, and the hypostyle hall from the Great Mosque in Cordoba, Spain, which is this here. The hypostyle hall's purpose was the same as the geometric patterning, is a sense of disorientation, so that when you go and pray, you're thinking about your prayers and talking to the divine and not the worldly things around you. Islam becomes an official religion in 650 AD. It's the world's fastest growing religion today. There are 5 pillars of Islam that sort of create the structure of the Islamic faith, and the Quran is written in Arabic only. There are translations of the Quran, but once the Quran is translated, it is no longer a holy book. So only the Quran in Arabic is truly the Quran. Okay, well, that is the review for today. Lori, do you have questions that I can answer?
Yes, they're mostly from the study guide that I've been filling out.
Great. I'm happy to answer those for you.
I guess a quick rundown of Jesus in early Christian and Byzantine art, because I think I got the ending part where he was depicted more later on, but not the progression of it.
Okay, So when we studied early Christian, if you go back to that lesson, you'll see in the very beginning that most of the images of Jesus are very plebeian looking. He's shown with big head and big hands and squatty bodies. And that is because at that time, the people who were converting to Christianity were of the plebeian class. Soon, even the patrician class begins starting to depict their art as plebeian in the early Christian era, so that they realize that it's a form of social control. It's so that the people realize that the emperors have joined Christianity and are with them instead of against them. As things progress, though, and we look at images of Jesus in mosaics, Jesus starts to look more and more royal. He grows taller, the head gets smaller, and so do the hands. They begin by dressing him in simple robes that are more brightly colored, like blue or purple, until we get to the height of the first golden age, where Jesus looks like he is full-fledged patrician class. That would be indicated by the imperial style. I'll move to the next slide so I can kind of give you an example. While this isn't Jesus, Justinian takes that place of Jesus here, but you can see how the cheeks have this fleshy blush color. Those portraits of Jesus towards the end of the first golden age, Jesus has that imperial style look to him. He's got reddish cheeks. The eyes are done in heavy line work. They're wide set and almond shaped. And the cheeks have sort of this ruddiness to them. When you finally get to the second golden age of Byzantine, there's no guesswork. Jesus is 100% royalty. So do you see that now a little bit better?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and if you want more examples, go back to the lecture online and just kind of look at the images a little bit more closely and compare like an image of Jesus at the beginning of the first golden age, and then go towards the middle of the lecture and look at another image, and it'll kind of give you the ability to see the differences.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions from the style guide or study guide?
Well, I guess it'd be over certain people.
Okay, go ahead.
Mohammed,
Okay.
I remember him being brought up in the lecture, but not that much.
Yeah, so okay, if you've got a term like that you're like, I remember this person being brought up in lecture, but I don't really remember like a whole big history, that means that it's not going to be covered as much on the exam, because I didn't teach you as much about it, but I'll definitely tell you who Muhammad is because he's important. Muhammad is the one who is looked at as the highest prophet in Islam. He is the one who declared that it was important not to show images of people in the church. He knew, for the same reason that the Christians don't show images of people in the church, or Protestant Christians don't show images of people in the church. That has to do with worshiping graven images. Muhammad was so concerned about it that he said he forbade people being in the church. Muhammad was a supreme prophet, but in Christianity, we look at that like Jesus was a supreme prophet who goes into heaven and becomes part of God. In Islam, God is God, and Muhammad is a supreme prophet and goes to heaven and is with God. So there's no like joining of Muhammad and God. So that's the main difference between Christianity and it's one large difference between Christianity and Islam. Muhammad died in 650 AD, and that's when Islam became a major world religion. And Muhammad, I think he died in Mecca, and that's why people who practice Islam pray towards the east, assuming that they're standing in the west. Because if you're already in the east, it depends on where you are in the world as to which way you face when you pray, but you are to pray towards Mecca.
Thank you.
Sure.
I guess the last one would be the difference between the Islamic manuscript illuminations and the Christian illuminations.
Okay, so Christian manuscript illuminations often, well, mostly had people in them. Islamic manuscript illuminations mostly had text. So a lot of times Christian manuscript illuminations would tell a story in the illumination, and so you'd see lots of people in those illuminations, whereas Islamic manuscript illuminations weren't allowed to have people in them, and so they're just calligraphy. We didn't really cover that one hard, so you might get one question on the exam, but it's not going to be a major concept.
Okay, well, thank you.
You are welcome. Is that all the questions I can answer for you?
Yep.
Okay, so as you're studying, this goes for anybody. If you're studying and all of a sudden you realize you have another question that you need answered, just pick up the phone and give me a call. I'm really relaxed about the phone, especially during exam week, because I know if you got a quick question, you really need it answered, that I would want my professor to be available to answer that question for me too. So please feel free to pick up the phone and give me a ring anytime. If I happen to be busy, I will just call you right back. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Happy studying and good luck on the test. Bye-bye now.